The Ukrainian AI community used to create, develop, and educate for a shining future. But then Russia ruined our peace. We switched to a new reality. We do our best to defend our country. The brightest AI minds came to share knowledge with us. Together, we will build a technological and secure future. Peace in Ukraine equals peace in the world. Support Ukraine. Support the AI community.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to AI for Ukraine by AI House, a series of workshops and lectures held by international AI experts and professionals to support and develop our Ukrainian tech community during this war. Yesterday, we did have a dark day all over Ukraine. I hope you and your beloved ones are safe. Kind reminder, during this session, please do not neglect air raid sirens and go to the shelter when it's on. Remember, your security is our top priority. And by the way, you'll be able to watch this session on demand till the end of this week. So, guys, let's triple donations and force our victory. And as an option, you can use and find the link for donation under this video. My name is Bogdan. I am the CEO of AI House. We are building AI community in Ukraine through initiatives like this. And we're gonna announce many other events for the upcoming year soon. So just follow us on social media and stay tuned. Our topic today is quite interesting and very, very inspirational. It is modeling personal experiences shared in online communities by brilliant Maria Antoniak. In several minutes, Maria will be on the screen. Meanwhile, I would like to show you a tool we are going to use for the questions during the live stream. Please, guys, open slido.com in your browser and put AI for Ukraine code, then name and your email. Or just scan the QR code, which is you can see on the screen, or go via the link under the video. I think QR code is the simplest one. I always use it. So, guys, let's try it together to be sure it works. Share with us what type of organization are you working in. It can be like startup, enterprise, academia, or like something other. So, guys, I will start a poll. So please respond and let me know. And while you're answering, here's some facts about Maria. Maria is a young investigator at the Allen Institute for AI on the Semantic Scholar team. Her research is in natural language processing and culture analytics. Maria explores the reliability of unsupervised NLP methods when applied to socially specific datasets. And moreover, she's interested in using computational method to study stories, healthcare, and online communities. Maria earned her PhD in informational science at Cornell University. She has worked as a research intern at Microsoft Research, Twitter Cortex, Facebook Core, Data Science, and Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. I can continue for hours talking about Maria's achievements and her great experience. But I would better part the word. So, guys, please, very welcome, Maria. Maria, hello, nice to see you. Thank you for your effort. Thank you for your time. It's very, very, very important for us. It's unavailable for us. Thank you for your support. So, guys, I'm gonna come back here for a Q&A session. Please ask questions in Slido, upvote for the most interesting and we will definitely answer them. As well, you can donate during the live stream via the link under the video. And so, Maria, shall we? I'm passing the word to you. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak with you today. It's great to be here. I'm going to be sharing with you some of my dissertation research from my PhD, which I just finished this summer, about how people talk about themselves in online communities and how we can use natural language processing methods to explore those communities. I saw a lot of you are students and also a lot from corporations, so people working in industry. And I know the series of talks that you've had so far, you've had a great list of people, mostly focused, I think, on more like modeling problems. So how do we build natural language processing or machine learning models? And today will be perhaps a bit more applied. So how can we take those models and use them for data science and computational social science problems? And I also wanted to say I'm particularly happy to be here. My family, my father is Ukrainian. He was born in Western Ukraine, and I spent some time also in Western Ukraine as an adult teaching at the Ukrainian Catholic University. I wish I could address you in Ukrainian, but my Ukrainian is really bad. But I'm very happy to talk with you today and to support however I can. So let's get started talking about this research. So the title of the talk was about personal experiences shared in online communities. So why do we care about these personal experiences and people sharing them online? So there's something called self-disclosure. Self-disclosure is the act of making oneself known to others. For example, sharing your opinions, beliefs, and personal stories with other people. And when you make self-disclosures to other people, it can help strengthen social bonds and build trust between community members. Personal stories can also be persuasive and powerful rhetorical devices, and they can drive social movements like Me Too or Black Lives Matter. And finally, sharing disclosures in a community can help both the individuals and the community as a whole make sense of complicated experiences together. And there are so many disclosures made on the internet on different platforms and communities where people can share their personal stories, their opinions, their reviews, and computational tools can help us model many of these disclosures at once. For example, prior research by other computational social scientists has used computational text processing methods to show that for example, disclosing can encourage others to share more details when they disclose, or that community members make more negative disclosures in private settings. So these are the examples of the types of things that we can learn via these online communities and text processing methods. And among these text processing methods, I'm most focused on unsupervised distributional models, which are a particular class of text processing model that relies on word co-occurrences to discover patterns in text collections. These methods include, for example, topic models and word embeddings. Labels aren't needed for these methods, so we can learn without high upfront costs. You just need the text data. And for this and for other reasons, these methods have become popular in the field of cultural analytics, which uses computational tools to study cultural phenomenon. These unsupervised methods are powerful, but they are also a bit dangerous. Evaluation is tricky without ground truth labels, and we're working in a domain where many researchers will have preconceptions about what they expect the methods to find. If we're working in this grounded domain, like in a particular online community like Reddit, you may have personal experience in that community. And so you may, again, have preconceptions about what you're expecting to find. And because we don't have labeled data, you can have some confirmation bias, for example. So it's good to keep this in mind, this risk in mind when we are using these methods. And so studying personal stories and disclosures are high-stakes settings where we're making claims about people's online interactions, their internal biases, and various social issues like social movements. So it's really important that first that we study these questions, that's important, but also that when we study them, it's important to study them carefully. And the reason why this is so important is that models, our machine learning models, are being reused in novel ways to do this research. So I like to think about a distinction between upstream and downstream research that uses these distributional models. So let's think about a standard natural language processing pipeline. If you work, in industry, or if you've taken some machine learning classes in school, this is kind of the traditional pipeline that you might be used to. So we start with some person or set of people who have their own internal ideas. They write some of those ideas down, maybe on the internet. And as they write those ideas down, they explicitly or implicitly include their own mental biases in that process. Then of those things that they write down, of those written documents, we, the researchers, or someone collects a data set of documents, which has been curated over time, and it could be missing data, or it could be altered or manipulated in some way. For example, if you're working with social media data, as you collect that data, it could be the case that people have deleted some of their posts over time. And then once we have a data set, we might use that to learn, for example, some embedding space where words or documents can be measured in relation to each other based on context. And then we can use word or document vectors from that space as input, for example, to a classifier. And then those classifiers might be used for various applications in industry or shared research tasks, like serving job ads based on a user's profile or predicting the toxicity level of a text. However, these tools are also getting reused in other contexts, especially in cultural analytics or in computational social science. These are the upstream use cases where we're using the model to answer questions about the source data set or its author. But the tools weren't usually designed for those use cases. They were designed for the downstream use cases. And so when we're using them in this upstream setting, we might need to rethink the stability of their outcomes. Because in that downstream setting, usually we're only concerned with the original training data set insofar as it generalizes downstream to our final task. But when we're moving upstream, now the training data set is the central object of study. So my main research goal is to think carefully about this transition from downstream models to upstream use cases. And I'm interested in probing the reliability of NLP methods when used in new contexts and on small and socially specific data sets. I'm also interested in how people write about their personal experiences in online communities, for example, sharing their healthcare experiences or reading experiences publicly online. I'm also interested in doing this research with care for the data set and datasets and their authors. So I've published work in both of those research communities in natural language processing and in cultural analytics. In my applied work, I focus on communities that blend very personal disclosures and stories with large public audiences. Today, I'll present 2 case studies, if there's time, from these research areas. So 2 case studies from my work on online communities. And I'll begin with a study of a specific online community about pregnancy and childbirth, the stories shared in that community, and how we can use text processing tools to learn about these stories. So we'll move now into the specific research study. So this is a study of a community, an online Reddit community where people share their birth stories. So what are birth stories? Birth stories are detailed personal narratives of real experiences giving birth. These stories have been shared through human history, of course, but recently they become very popular online. There are YouTube channels, podcasts, forums, like all kinds of places on the internet where people are sharing thousands and thousands of these stories with each other. So let's look at an example. These stories are really long, so we won't be able to read a whole story, but I'll just read part of this one. And this example, like all the other examples in this talk, have been paraphrased, so you can't easily identify the person who who originally wrote the story. So the story says, I'll begin just by saying that this subreddit has taught me so much in preparation for my first birth. I gained a lot of insight into other people's experiences, and I loved reading all the stories, whether positive or negative. I hope that sharing my story helps someone in the same way. It was 1 a.m., April 5th. I was experiencing some light cramping and couldn't fall asleep. This was pretty normal since 39 weeks, so I wasn't worried. My husband woke up and was rubbing my back when I felt a pop. I told my husband, and he thought it was just my back cracking, but I realized that it was my water breaking. I told my husband that it looks like it's time to go to the hospital, and it was 3:30 a.m. at that point. We headed to the hospital and got admitted. The nurse checked me, which was extremely painful to the point that I wanted to cry. She said that I wasn't even 1 centimeter dilated, which didn't surprise me because I was supposed to be induced on April 8th. They got me started on Pitocin to help start contractions and moved me to the delivery room at 4:45 a.m. And the story goes on from there. Like, this is just the beginning of this particular story. So again, they're quite long. We can't read the whole thing, but just from this excerpt, I think you can see that these stories contain a lot of detailed medical information. So there are times, medications, decisions made, but also a lot of emotional and interpersonal information. So interactions with medical professionals and family, emotions and feelings before, during, and after birth. And I highlighted some of the events in the story that we will see recurring later in the talk. And we're particularly interested in birth stories because we have a chance to help make these voices heard. So in the US, maternal mortality rates are higher for Black and Indigenous women than for white women. And to make this even sadder, many of these deaths and complications like postpartum depression are preventable by simple measures such as following procedures, paying attention to the pregnant person, and listening to their needs and their story with empathy. So now that we have a sense of what these stories are about, a couple questions present themselves. These stories tend to follow common narrative patterns and community conventions. So what narrative pathways are described? What sequences of events are normal or unusual? Or rather, instead of normal, what sequences of events are typical versus which ones are unusual? And how are those sequences framed? Second, power is a huge theme in these stories and seems to be a key to understanding disappointment in childbirth. So who do the authors view as holding power, and in what ways are those people powerful? And to answer also some questions about narrative, we can also think about these birth stories as a really valuable narrative data set. So within the field of natural language processing, there's a subfield of narrative analysis. And it is a difficult subtopic in some ways because of the data that we are left to work with. So I'm showing here a kind of spectrum of natural language processing data sets for stories and narratives. So on one side, we have these kind of artificial and simple data sets where you have like really simple stories like John picked up the apple, John went to the office, John went to the kitchen, John dropped the apple. So it's quite simple, and it is useful in some ways to like test various capabilities of our narrative understanding models. But also it's not realistic. This isn't the type of story that we are usually actually interested in analyzing. And on the far other side, we have, novels, poetry, really long and complex texts, which we would really like to be able to analyze, but they're also very difficult to analyze. So the nice thing about healthcare stories and these, for example, these birth stories, is that they feature texts with disclosures and stories that would fall in the middle of this axis. So we want data sets that are realistic and challenging, but that still have enough shared structure to make our analysis and evaluation feasible and clear. So birth stories for narrative analysis and other personal medical stories hit that target, and they're a great test bed for narrative analysis techniques. These stories have shared sets of events, shared event sequences, and shared personas or characters. But at the same time, each story is unique and represents a complex set of human interactions and motivations. So with these motivations in mind, both about the healthcare situation itself and wanting to make these voices heard, and then also considering these birth stories as a data set for narrative analysis, will now move into the data set itself. So I scraped a data set of birth stories from the subreddit r/baby-bumps. It's a really popular subreddit. These stories were shared on that forum as individual posts. And here I'm showing a random sample of post titles. Again, I've paraphrased them for privacy, so the names are not the real names. And we filter the posts for those containing the n-gram birth story. So people talk about or write about a lot of different topics in this subreddit related to pregnancy and childbirth, like all different topics. But some of the posts, they include this n-gram birth story. And so those are the posts that we are interested in and that we include in our data set. Now, this data, while exciting, also has some limitations. Most importantly, it's not a random sample. This is a study of one unique online community. So for example, this data set only contains happy endings with no lost pregnancies. This is a choice on the part of the community, both the particular one that we studied and the larger online birth stories community. So when people label their posts with birth story, they almost never include lost pregnancies. There is a whole other genre of, for example, stillbirth stories that have their own narrative conventions and that we don't explore in this paper. Within this data set, there's also a skew towards home and unmedicated births, so giving birth at home. We don't have any demographic information for the authors. These are pseudonymous Reddit users. But what we can say is that they are writing in English. They're mostly describing experiences in the US, UK, and Canada. They do occasionally list the location, and that's usually where the locations are. And they have access to the internet and to Reddit. And from this data set, there are also some ethical tensions. You could think about, for example, these stories are very personal. They contain a lot of private information, not just about the author of the story, but also about the baby who didn't consent to having their healthcare information posted on Reddit. And so it's important to think through these ethical tensions when you're approaching any new data set, but especially a data set collected from the internet and from an online community. And there's a lot to discuss about that. I'd be happy to talk more about this in the Q&A, but in summary, our decisions for this particular data set were to paraphrase all the quotes the way that I have in this talk to make it more difficult to identify them. We release the collection processes, but we don't release the data itself. And we share our findings back to the subreddit via a post and a blog post. So let's start digging in and looking for some narrative patterns. We'll use a popular technique in natural language processing called topic modeling. This technique automatically discovers a set of topics or themes or discourses in a data set without any supervision or labeling. So when we use this technique, the output is a set of topics where each topic is represented by a probability distribution over words in the vocabulary, and each section of text is represented by a probability distribution over topics. So for each section of text, some topics are more likely than others, and for each topic, some words are more likely than others. And there are many different types of topic models. We use a latent Dirichlet allocation or LDA topic model trained on 100-word chunks from the stories. So rather than training on the entire story, we break the stories into about paragraph-sized pieces because we are interested in event sequences within the stories rather than data set level themes. So let's look at what that actually looks like. So given here, I'm showing our example story again. So the text is from the same story where we have kind of paragraphs or chunks of the story. And we divide each story into 10 equal segments and use our trained LDA model to calculate a topic distribution for each segment. So again, we have a probability distribution over the topics. That's what's shown on the right here. Topic 1, topic 2, topic 3, each topic has an associated probability for that section of text. So for like the first section of text that I'm showing here, topic 4 is the most likely topic. And story time, which I'm showing on the left, again, there are 10s, each story is broken up into 10 equal segments. So I'm just showing which segment we're in. And once we have those topics for the segments of story, we can plot the topic distributions over normalized narrative time. So here, along the x-axis is the normalized story time from 0 to 1, where 0 is the start of the story and 1 is the end of the story. And along the y-axis is the probability of the topic in the story averaged over all of the stories in the data set. And the error bounds here are showing the standard deviation across bootstrap samples of the data set. So here, for example, we're looking at a single topic. The most probable words in this topic are sleep, night, hours, rest, and slept. So it sounds like this is a topic about sleeping. And based on the patterns we see here, over the course of the whole data set, this topic within a story tends to peak at the beginning of story and at the end of a story. So there is not as much sleeping in the middle of giving birth as at the beginning or ends of these stories, which makes sense, probably. Here are plots for all 50 of the topics produced from our model. I know these are too small for you to read the individual words probably, but hopefully you can see the beautiful temporal patterns for each of the topics. I've ordered the plots roughly by where in story time the topic peaks. And looking at these images, we start to get a pretty good idea of the story and time-based patterns in this community. We have an idea of the prominent discourses and the narrative arcs that these discourses tend to follow. I'll just pick out some examples. So at the beginning of the story, we have some topics, for example, about a due date and induction date, a topic about water breaking, and a topic about calling the midwife. Whereas at the end of the stories, we have topics about the birth size and weight of the baby. There's a breastfeeding topic. There's a positive sentiment topic. So it's kind of like happy and like positive words that rises steadily over the course of the story. So the authors are framing things more and more positively as the story goes on. And then there's a community-specific topic at the very end where people share links to photos of the baby. So it's just a convention in this community that often at the end of the story, you'll share a link to a photo. Not always, but often. Next, we can examine the most probable sequences of topics. So for each chunk in the story, we find the most probable topic. And for each consecutive pair of topics, we increment a transition count. And finally, we normalize those counts over all of the transitions. Using this very simple method, we can recover a clear set of narrative pathways in our set of birth stories. So here I'm showing the topics, as well as a beginning of story and end of story state, and transitions with probabilities over a low threshold. So let's zoom in on a set of diverging pathways in the middle of the story. The first path is a traditional sequence of events where nothing goes wrong. So there's a positioning topic, so bed, back, tub, ball. This is the person trying to like get into the comfortable position. A contractions topic, pushing, the birth of the baby, so seeing the head of the baby, the husband is there, the baby's hand, then the cutting of the cord and hearing the baby cry, putting the baby on your chest, and then the birth size and weight of the baby. They go in order. But next to them, there's another sequence of events representing the medicalized version of the events that we just looked at. So instead of contractions starting on their own, the medication Pitocin is used to start them. Pain medication, the epidural, is given for contractions. The baby's heart rate is monitored. There's a topic about C-section and also surgery and anesthesiology. And I really like to emphasize these diverging pathways that emerge from this data set. Childbirth is often a surveilled and judged experience, with many feeling pressure to use or not use certain support systems. However, even in this online birth stories community, we see that there's not one single way to give birth. There are multiple pathways that mostly lead to the same outcome. And once we've identified the common narrative arcs, we can then look for outliers and examine the author's framing of those outlier stories. So up to now, we've been thinking in the terms of averages. So what, across all the stories, what does the average narrative arc look like? Now we want to look for stories that deviate from that average. So we'll begin by identifying all the stories with a certain bigram in the post title. For example, here I'm showing 2 stories where the bigram positive medicated was included in the post title. So we would find all the stories that have positive medicated in the post title. As before, we find the most prominent topic for each section of the story. And we use our learned transition probabilities to understand how likely or unlikely this particular sequence of topics was in this community. We find the sum of these log probabilities, and we use the mean of these scores to rank the bigrams by how surprising or unsurprising their associated stories are. Here I'm showing those bigrams from the post titles and the average log probabilities of the topic sequences in their respective stories. So here, higher values are shown on the left and indicate more likely stories, while lower values on the right indicate less likely topic sequences in this community. So let's pull out a couple of examples here. So first, we see the word positive often, though not always, occurs in titles of more predictable stories, the more likely stories that are on the left. The words trauma and trigger warning often appear in titles of surprising stories. The words unplanned and emergency, words referring to emergency medical procedures occur in titles of surprising stories. There's prior work, like qualitative work, that has found that negative emotions in birth are often associated with a lack of control. Or in this case, we're seeing these unexpected and unplanned events associated with these less likely stories. And surprisingly, perhaps, I was surprised by this, we also see the bigram happy ending often occurs in titles of stories with less likely topic transitions. There's a lot to unpack there, but in this case, one thing that I think is happening is that happy ending reflects a desire to reframe stories that include many negative events, but that the author wants to portray as successful for this community. Now, we're going to move on from the topic arcs that we were just looking at to thinking about people in these stories, because stories aren't just events, they're also about people, and interactions between those people can help reveal, for example, power dynamics. So we rank the list. First, we go looking for who's discussed in these stories. So we rank the list of entities occurring in each story and collapse the most frequent entities into a set of 10. Not all personas occur in all stories. For example, there's one story in the data set that is told from the first person plural, so using like we, us, our, because that story was told from the point of view of the pregnant person's partner. But there's only one story like that. So there is the author themselves, usually first person singular, first person plural, so we, us, and ourselves. There's the baby, a doctor is usually mentioned, partner, this could be partner, husband, wife, family, which we've grouped together into a single persona. There might be a midwife, there might be an anesthesiologist who gives pain medication, like the epidural. There might be a nurse, and then there might be a doula. And doulas are interesting persona in these stories. So a doula is like a birth coach who provides constant informational, emotional, social, and physical support during childbirth, as compared with nurses who only spend about 10% of their time on these modes of support in the US. Prior work has shown that having a doula's support can improve birth outcomes and satisfaction in the birth experience. But doulas, despite these positive qualities, have a long and interesting history and cultural placement, and they've been characterized as liminal figures in prior work, given that they have their position is both outside and inside the US medical system. Given all of this context, we're really interested in how the doula is framed in these stories. When the doula is included, you can see here the doula is the least often included persona, and that is again for all these complicated cultural reasons in the US. So once we have those personas, we can look at relationships between personas using a lexicon of verbs labeled with power and agency. This dataset was designed originally for movie scripts, but we find it generalizes surprisingly well to our dataset. Within this lexicon, it's a list of verbs where each verb is labeled with a directional power score, where power is considered as something directional that indicates authority and a high level of control. And again, we're really interested in control, knowing that lack of control can be associated with unhappiness with the birth experience. So for example, I'm showing a sentence here. The nurse accused me of not feeding my child. So in this example, the verb accuse is in our lexicon of verbs, and it is labeled as giving power to its subject and taking power from its direct object. So the person accusing has more power than the person being accused. So for each verb in the lexicon, it will say whether the subject or the object has power or lacks power. So using this lexicon and using our list of entities, we can look over the whole data set and measure the power of each persona in each story and average over all the stories. So perhaps, as you might expect, the baby has the least amount of power, while medical professionals have a lot of power. Maybe a little more unexpected, the author frames themselves as having very little power on average. Like they're the least powerful persona after the baby. This is how they frame themselves in these stories. While on the other hand, the doula and the midwife are framed as very powerful personas, as powerful or maybe more powerful than the medical professionals like the doctor and the nurse. And we can also look at these same power scores for dyads of personas, which I'm not showing here, but we can look at in more detail if you're curious in the Q&A, where two personas occur as the subject and object of the same verb. And so when that happens, we find that the doula specifically is framed as usually trumping the other most powerful persona, the nurse, when they're paired as subject and object of the same verb. So these scores are showing us how this community of authors frame their own narratives on average. We can manually check that a wide distribution of verbs are contributing to these scores. So here are the verbs contributing the most positively and the most negatively to the power scores for each persona. And I'm indicating whether the persona was the subject or object of the verb. Again, the same word can contribute to both positive and negative power, depending on whether the persona was the subject or object. For example, the baby is often pushed and delivered, which contributes to the baby's negative power score, while the doctor calls, checks, and decides, which contributes to the doctor's positive power score. The doula, as usual, is an interesting case with both very strong associations with both high and low power verbs. For example, the verb hire only really occurs with the doula, highlighting that weird space that the doula occupies in the US medical system. Usually in the US, you don't hire the doctor, you don't hire the nurse, you might not even hire the midwife, but you have to hire the doula. This is a conscious choice that has to be made on the part of the pregnant person. But at the same time, so hire is a low power verb in our lexicon, but at the same time, the doula also calls, suggests, holds, keeps, shows, and reminds as a powerful advocate for the pregnant person. And we can use those computational results to re-explore the set of birth stories and discover some specific texts where power hierarchies are enacted. Thinking about that low power verb hire, for example, we can look for passages containing that verb, and what we find are passages where the themes of power and control reemerge. So in this first example, it says, I had planned on a natural birth, had hired a doula, read books, all of those things. And here I was on a random Monday, just going about my business when the baby decided to arrive. It took me a while to process all of it. So in this example, It describes the actions that the author has taken to control events and the disruption of this control by the baby. So in this particular example, this was actually an example where the baby is actually framed as a powerful persona. The second example says, the nurse said that if I wasn't more dilated by 12 p.m., that she was going to start me on Pitocin. I was scared about this happening. I'd heard a lot about the cascading interventions that often happen in hospitals. That's why I hired a doula, so that I could have another point of view and someone to guide me so I could have this birth naturally. So in this example, it's highlighting the power of the nurse and the author's view of the doula as an opposing power. Both of these examples highlight the author's perspective of the doula as a powerful persona who can circumvent the medical hierarchy. And I think these examples that I'm showing here show how we can use computational methods from data science, from natural language processing and machine learning, to zoom back in on the data set rather than always zooming out and losing all of the rich qualitative detail that exists in the data. So considering this case study overall, we find that we can use computational tools to model the shared narrative patterns and power framing in a community set of birth stories. We discovered sets of diverging pathways. We found outlier stories labeled with terms of surprisal, trauma, and happy endings. And we measured the author's framing of their own lack of power and the surprising power of doulas. And we want to use big data, again, not only to zoom out, but to zoom in on people's personal experiences. Observational and randomized studies have already found improvements in outcomes. For example, lower rates of C-sections, higher satisfaction when doulas are included. So we already know that from prior work. What our study adds is detail about how doulas can help empower pregnant people and how pregnant people view doulas, for example. They act, in these stories, doulas are framed as acting as advocates who circumvent the medical hierarchy and in particular, circumvent the nurse. So now I'm going to move, I misspoke at the start. I'm not going to do the online reading communities. I'm going to move into a different study about seed selection and how seed selection can affect bias measurement. So actually, we're going to move from a more grounded case study, a case study grounded in like one specific community, to stepping back to thinking about some of our computational methods and some of the dangers in using those methods for grounded case studies like this, when we're approaching a particular community and trying to make judgments about framing or what people think, trying to measure what people think about things. So there's some dangers when we use our computational tools to make those kinds of judgments. So we're going to step into this second case study, which we'll go through more quickly than the first one. So going back to that upstream, downstream distinction that I drew at the beginning of the talk, one example to think about that distinction is bias detection and debiasing of word embeddings. This line of work is focused on measuring and or removing unwanted harmful human biases from our natural language processing pipelines. We can think of the biases as trickling downstream from the authors of the data set into the data itself, into our models, and into the outcomes, a problem we need to solve. Or we can think about biases from a trained embedding as evidence of, for example, racial bias in political speeches, where the model is providing evidence for the upstream data source. This view is common in computational social science and cultural analytics, where the bias measurement methods aren't addressing a problem to be solved, or at least not necessarily a problem in the model, but rather help us learn about a particular data set and its authors. And maybe I can just restate this a little more bluntly, which is like, at some point a few years ago, there was a flurry of papers about word embeddings, specifically in models like Word2Vec, and people realizing that, oh no, there's bias baked into these models, and if we rely on these models for tasks like serving job ads to people, we might be, for example, serving more programming job ads to men rather than women because of the data set that we trained on. And this is something we need to fix. So that was the kind of NLP perspective. But the cultural analytics and computational social science perspective was a little different. It was, oh, wow, we actually have a computational way to study human biases. How exciting, how wonderful. And we can try this out on all kinds of data sets where we've long wanted to study these questions. The problem is that these methods are not always reliable. So bias measurement methods then, there's been increasing interest in NLP in that downstream framing I just described, in seeking to measure and account for harmful human biases like racial or gender bias that are encoded in our models and data sets. By harmful human biases, I mean stereotypes like gender or race-based associations that we don't want in our model. These methods are, again, also getting reused in cultural analytics and computational social science to make claims about data sets and their authors. These methods are used to measure biases that can range. These methods to measure biases can range from simple word counts to embedding-based similarities. But crucially, all of these bias measurement methods, whether upstream or downstream, whether using word counts or word embeddings or contextualized word embeddings, they all rely on lexicons of seed terms, so just lists of words. These are custom lists of words meant to represent a particular concept. Let's go through an example of the bias measurement process at a high level. This is a real example that has been repeated in several papers. So these studies often start with two big fuzzy concepts that perhaps aren't well defined, but seek to measure a relationship between them. For example, they might want to know whether there's a biased association between gender and career in some data set. So to make the problem tractable, these studies often reduce gender to a binary, and they then use census data as placeholders for career information, and they use demographic data to split those careers into those with more men or more women. Both of those decisions are reductive. Some of those decisions might be necessary, while others can be harmful. There's also often a lack of nuance and definitional clarity. The terminology is often conflated in these studies, for example, using gender and sex interchangeably. Next, these studies replace the census data and gender binary with lists of words that they hope represent the original big fuzzy concepts. So the career words come from the census data, while the gender words are hand-selected in these examples. Finally, they measure the relationships between these lists of words. For example, these studies might try to measure the cosine similarity between the word vectors for woman, homemaker, and doctor. They do the same for the words representing men and compare those measurements to the words representing women. And what they want to know is which sets are closer to which other sets. The studies then use this as evidence of gender bias in the training data set and its authors. But it's important to remember where these studies all started and the choices that were made along the way. So what happened to these original concepts? Sometimes the lexicons can get lost in the framing of results about these concepts. But researchers need to pay attention to those lexicons, those lists of words, since that's what those studies are actually measuring. So what do those lexicons look like in practice? These seeds, by seeds I just mean the words included in these sets. These seed words are usually divided into attribute sets, which often represent groups of people, and target sets, which often represent sentiment or roles. Though really these sets could represent any concept that you want. Again, they're just lists of words. But let's dig a little deeper. So if we examine some of these seed sets more closely, we might find examples like these. These are all from popular, highly cited, and frequently reused papers. And these sets highlight various problems, which I'll discuss in detail later. But at first glance, one thing I'll just point out, you can see that, for example, if we define domestic work, so domestic work otherwise is a list of words like cook, clean, vacuum, words like this. If you include the words mom and mum in the domestic work category, and then you try and compare that category to a list of words for women to show, for example, that there's a gender bias, you're going to find of course you're going to find a gendered association because you've included gendered words in the domestic work category, and your conclusions are going to be less trustworthy. So it's really important that we actually know what words are included in these lexicon sets before we use them. And these examples raise some big questions. So are these the right seed words? Are researchers and practitioners aware of what's inside these lexicons? And how reliable are these lexicons? I focus here on two popular bias measurement methods. There are many, many other methods. This has been a really popular research area over the last few years, but there are often variations of these two methods. And I'm focusing on these as examples because they've been often reused in the cultural analytics setting. Both methods represent words as vectors in an embedding space, and they measure bias using cosine similarity between word vectors. The WEAT, or Word Embedding Association test, for example, directly uses this embedding space to measure similarities between sets of word vectors. This test compares differences in mean cosine similarities between sets of target and attribute terms, and a higher test value indicates a stronger relationship between the target and attribute seeds. So really what it's doing at a high level conceptually is just measuring, given these sets of words, how close are they to each other, and how does that differ across these different sets? Differences of differences. The PCA method, or principal component analysis method, similarly relies on a learned word embedding space, but it also requires that the words are paired with one another across the sets. Using these pairings, you construct a difference matrix and test whether the majority of the variance is explained by the first principal component. If so, this might be a good representation for the desired bias subspace. And then we then measure bias via cosine similarity, as in the WEAT method, between the attribute words and that first principal component. So let's look at a motivating example. Imagine that you are a cultural analytics scholar studying online book reviews. Or maybe you're a data scientist working for Amazon and you're working with these book reviews. You're interested in whether women are portrayed differently in reviews for different genres. You use a popular embedding-based method along with lexicons of target and attribute words from prior work. Maybe you hypothesize that reviews of romance novels frame women more positively because more of these reviewers are women. So let's try this experiment with different seed sets from real papers. We'll use different sets of words representing women, which are shown on the y-axis. And on the x-axis, we show the cosine similarity of those terms to an average vector for unpleasant. So if we see that the vectors for women are more similar to unpleasant in one genre versus the other genre, that might indicate a gender bias. So here the green boxes indicate scores for romance reviews, while the purple boxes indicate scores for history and biography reviews. These are book reviews again. So with our first seed set, we see that there's not much difference. The boxes are overlapping, and it looks like there's no gender bias between these two genres. For this seed set, again, there's no gender bias. Different distribution this time, but again, there's not a measurable bias. Now things are starting to shift a bit with this seed set. And with this set of seeds, we do see a difference between the boxes. And with this set, we see an even greater difference, indicating that there is a gender bias after all, maybe. So we found very different results using different lexicons, even though each of these lexicons seem reasonable at first glance and has been used in prior work to represent our target concept. There are other points we could take issue with here, like the gender binary, but even accepting all of those reductions, we have cause to worry. If we had relied on only one of these sets and hadn't compared all these distinct sets, we wouldn't have even known that there would be these differences in the results. Maybe we would have only used that first set and said there's no gender bias, or maybe we would have only used the last set and said that there is a strong gender bias, not realizing how much our results are affected by the specific words that we chose. So now that we've run through some of these examples, the questions we might want to answer are how seeds are selected, from which sources are they drawn, where do they come from, and then which features of seeds can cause instability in bias measurements. So thinking about the instability that we just saw in that example, where did that instability come from? So we surveyed 18 recent highly cited papers using lexicons for bias measurement. We gather and document 178 seed sets. These are available on our GitHub repo that's linked from my website. Using those seeds, we create a framework of common seed sources. And this framework describes the processes and the resources that are often used to create seed sets for bias measurement. And it can help researchers and practitioners think through the risks and benefits of these different sources. Full details are given in the paper, and I'm going to skip over that for now. But basically, for each source that I'm showing here on this slide, we go through different incentives, so reasons why you might want to use lexicon from that source, and then some risks involved in relying on that particular source. Then our second research question was, which seed features affect bias measurements? And we identified 3 kinds of factors that affect those measurements. Definitional factors, so how the target concepts are defined. Lexical factors, features of individual seeds. And set factors, features of the seed sets. So the first of those factors was definitional, how the target concepts are defined. So the definitions can be reductive and essentializing, codifying life experiences into traditional categories. But also the definitions of the target concepts can be imprecise, like the example we saw earlier with mom and mum being included in domestic work. So if the target concept isn't well defined, the resulting seed terms can be too broad and include multiple concepts, risking the creation of confounded or circular arguments. Then there are these lexical factors, features of individual seeds of words. Prior work has found that high-frequency words are not comparable to low-frequency words, and has also found that comparing distinct parts of speech can result in different bias subspaces. And then there are these set factors, features of seed sets as groups, so the lists of words as a whole. And we examined 3 set factors in this study. So first, prior work has shown that the number of seeds per set can affect bias measurements. And then we include experiments showing that the alignment or the ordering of the seeds can affect the discovered bias subspace. And we also show, using both gathered and generated sets of seeds, that the similarity of sets to each other correlates with changes to the bias subspace. So there's lots of results in the paper. I'm going to drop down into the details and just show a couple of experiments very quickly. So as one test for set alignment, we rank the full vocabulary by each term's similarity to the bias subspace. In the ordered case on the left, we see that our target words like he and she are at opposite ends of the space, which is what we expect. But in the shuffled case on the right, the space is much less interpretable. So seeds from the set representing men are now on both ends of the space, which wasn't our goal. They're all mixed together. These lists are ranked by their mean similarity across 20 models trained on bootstrap samples of the data sets. And in the paper, we additionally design and describe a coherence test that measures these differences in more detail. Here I show another test of set alignment, a replication of a study previously carried out on embeddings trained on internet-scale collections. Remember that in the PCA method of measuring bias, we run PCA on a difference matrix representing paired or ordered seed terms like man, woman, he, she. And this figure is showing the 10 principal components along the x-axis and the proportion of explained variance on the y-axis. So as expected, the first principal component explains the most variance, indicating that this could be a good representation for us to use as our gender bias subspace. After the first component, the explained variance falls off rapidly, and we see a single dominant first component. But these are results for those aligned pairs of seeds, man, woman, he, she. What happens when we shuffle the seeds so the words are paired at random? So they're still within their sets. We still have our words representing men and our words representing women, but now instead of man, woman, we pair them, for example, man, she, and he, woman. And what we find is that there's no longer a single dominant principal component, which you might find surprising in the case of gender, that simply reordering the words can produce such a dramatic effect, given the grammatical clarity of that difference in English. We might also find it unsurprising, given the different part of speech types. So the goal with this figure isn't to say that order matters in every single case, that you will always find a different result, but that it can have a significant difference on your results. And then the last figure that I'm going to show is showing that it's more difficult to represent the variance of seed sets that are too close together. So in this figure, each point represents a pair of seed sets. So these are whole lists of words. Each point is representing a pair of them. Blue points show artificial, automatically generated seeds, which are described more in the paper. And the pink points are showing gathered seed sets from prior work. that I described earlier. The x-axis shows the cosine similarity between the set mean vectors with more similar sets on the right. And the y-axis is the same as the figure that we were just looking at. It shows the proportion of variance explained by that first principal component. We highlight two comparisons between gathered sets, which were both intended to measure racial bias, but explain different degrees of variance. So these are two operationalizations of the same concept, but you would find a different bias representation depending on which one you used. If you relied on only one of these, it could distort your view of the source data. So the contributions from this work include the following. We documented and tested 178 seed sets from prior work with a framework for understanding the risks and benefits of each seed source. We investigated seed features that can lead to instability, and we gave some recommendations for practitioners, which you can find in the paper and which I'll briefly overview now, which are just that you should trace the origins of the seed sets. Where did they come from? Examine seed features and compare multiple plausible sets. Don't just run on one set, but compare the results across multiple sets. And document all the seeds used for transparency and accessibility for future researchers. Okay, so we've made it through these two case studies that I wanted to highlight. If you're curious about any of these works I discussed or other work, you can find PDFs of everything on my website. And in summary, looking back at the case studies I presented, there's a lot of material for reflection here. So first, NLP tools are usually designed for downstream use cases that probably you've heard a lot about in some of the other talks in these series. But we can also use these tools for upstream use cases that yield lessons, for example, about biases and instability and cultural questions. And these online communities can be windows into personal stories and experiences. These grounded communities can make computational analysis more feasible. And we can do this work with care by sampling carefully, considering data ethics, giving back to the community, and working on illuminating issues with social and humanist significance. So that is all I have. Thank you again so much for having me. I've included this old, almost 10 years old photo of me in Kyiv in a very cold day with the big coat on. I miss Ukraine very much. I hope I can come visit very soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria, so much. Your case study is literally terrific, like motivating example, this bias measurements, seed sets. That's amazing. I already know a couple of people are gonna send the record because they're doing like kind of similar things and they're just creating startups in Ukraine. And our purpose is to put Ukraine in the global AI map. And with your help, that's for sure. Thank you so much. Appreciate it so much. And we have some questions from the audience. And let's start with the first one. I think the first question refers to the slides 31, 32. And the question is like, can you please elaborate on which issues can be solved by this approach and how exactly? Yeah, I have noted this 31, 32. So Maria, can you please answer? Thank you.
Got it. So I think those slides were showing the narrative graph. So multiple things. So one thing that I highlighted in the slides were those diverging pathways. So there's a lot of pressure and debate in this specific this birth community about what is the right way to give birth. Some people have very strong feelings about this, and some people who are giving birth feel a lot of pressure to give birth a certain way. For example, to use certain medications or to not use any medication at all. So one thing I'm highlighting there are those diverging pathways. Another thing, so if you are pregnant and are curious about what is it going to be like to give birth, you might go on the internet and Google, or you might talk with your doctor and they give you a brochure and it will have something, not a figure like this, but it will run through, these are the typical sequences of events that you can expect. And what is included in those lists, so in the paper we have some discussion about this if you're curious. We compare those like official descriptions of the event sequences to the event sequences that we find in this community. And we find some differences. So for example, in this community, there are a lot of events and detail about preparation, about going to the hospital, preparing to go to the hospital, once you get to the hospital, going to the delivery room. And all of that's kind of glossed over in a lot of those official resources. But it's something that clearly is very important to people in this community. So among many things, those are two things that I think that this method can help illuminate.
Perfect. Thank you, Maria. And thanks, Stepan, for the question. Another question we have from Bogdan. Which kinds of interactions, except for the power, do you think can be monitored?
So I think this is a question about, like, given some text data set, what kind of things can we measure? Like, what kind of interactions can we measure in text data in general? And there's so much, again, with some risks and instabilities that we need to keep in mind when using these methods. So of course, there's things like sentiment. This is really popular to try and measure sentiment automatically. Related is toxicity. Both of those methods definitely carry risks. Toxicity in particular, there's been a lot of recent work on tools that are used to automatically measure toxicity, which you might want to do, for example, like say you work at Twitter and you want to, automatically catch some people who are being really awful on the website. It turns out that those methods will give incorrect results in some cases, and will they'll say that like certain demographic groups, that their speech is more toxic than it actually is. It's just the slang that they happen to use. There's so many. I mean, I saw a data set recently on it's called the Moral Foundations data set, an update to that data set that you can use to examine the moral value that people carry. So many, many things.
Great. I'm just curious, could we detect Elon Musk's Twitter recently with this? Thanks.
Good.
Thank you. Another question from Marian. How easy we can transfer the approach taken in the research connected with giving birth to some other topic, for example, building a house, and what are the most important prerequisites are needed to analyze another topic?
So topic models can be used on most any data sets. Again, you don't need labeled data. But then if you want to use those topics to construct the kind of narrative pathway graphs that I was showing, what you are probably going to need is a data set that is structured or is grounded in a particular structured experience. So what made this work in this case is that there was a shared biological process and also a shared medical procedures. Like doctors are trained to do certain things in a certain order. So there's a structure to the events existing in the real world that is then being represented in the text, and that makes it easier for us to extract. So that's why I was showing on that narrative data set axis that these healthcare stories kind of fall in the middle in this sweet spot where it's easier for us to measure, but still realistic and interesting data. So I would look for data like that, where they're describing some common experience grounded in a real world process. House building might work for that.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Another question from Bogdan. Can those data and model behavior methods be used to improve the biased model, like fine-tuning or building something on top?
So I think if I understand the question right, so there's a lot of recent work trying to debias models. So for example, taking a word-to-vec model or taking BERT and removing the bad biases from this model. So if you go and look in the Association of Computational Linguistics, like the ACL proceedings, and if you search debias, you'll find a bunch of papers on this, including from this year. And so definitely you can to some extent, but there's big challenges with this approach. So first of all, the models, all that they are is bias. That's what they are, is measuring statistical patterns based on averages. So deciding which biases to remove and which biases to leave is pretty tricky. It's not clear that this is really the right solution to the problem. But if you're interested in this, definitely there's a lot of research on that topic.
Thank you very much. And very interesting question from Natalia. Do you know if there are AI programs being developed now to create a more effective, uplifting, and helpful community support for those who are processing a lot of trauma from this war in Ukraine?
I don't know of any. It would be so good if there was. If anyone knows of any, let me know. I have seen some recent work on less happy topics related to the war. So, for example, but I think useful, for example, trying to measure and track how Russian mis and disinformation is spread from government sources into news sources and then into like personal social media sources. So I've seen a study on Contacta and Facebook and Twitter trying to measure that spread. As I've seen work more, oh, I'm frozen. Okay, there we go. I've seen work on those topics, but not on this.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, me neither. Yeah, Maria, thank you so much. It was so very interesting, inspired, perfect cases, very useful for us. We hope we see you soon in Kiev after our victory. Thank you for your effort. Thank you for your time. Let's keep in touch. We're very inspired by your paper. Thank you. All the best, and see you soon. Cheers.
Thank you all.
And guys, we're closing. Hope you like this session as much as I did. Next, we have a talk from Francesco Locatello, brilliant pronunciation, senior applied scientist at Amazon Web Services. He will share his knowledge on casual representation learning. To help our organizers, I would like to turn a small poll to understand how you like this one. And guys, stay safe. See you next week. Check your inbox for updates. Hope you enjoyed it and see you soon. Enjoy. Bye.